welcome back to my channel. I wanted to do another video on some educational topics pertaining to equine sciences. For those of you who have horses or who ride, I'm sure you've heard the saying, no hoof, no horse. And that is a remarkably true saying. The hoof is such an important structure for the overall function of the horse. And it is honestly underrated, in my opinion, in terms of how much it contributes to other bodily issues, particularly soundness issues in the horse. So I wanted to go into detail on some studies that I have been looking at regarding hooves, namely horseshoes and different types of horseshoes and the impact that they can have on the hoof structure and the overall body of the horse, and just offer some people some information and some food for thought so that you can make more educated decisions for your horses. Before we jump into the topic, I just want to say that growing up, when I was learning how to handle horses and ride, my instructors and mentors at the time taught me a lot of things that I later learned were untrue. There is a huge lack of quality control and required certification in the horse world. So for example, a lot of trainers can just basically say, I'm a trainer, and start charging people for training. And that's really all it takes to be a professional. There's not really standardized education to ensure that they are passing off information that is actually accurate, and it can result in a lot of misinformation being passed down generation by generation. I don't think that this happens intentionally at all. I don't think that trainers are trying to be deliberately deceptive or intentionally passing down misinformation. They actually believe what they say, but it results in a lot of confusion. So for years now, I've had to unlearn stuff that for many, many years I believed to be true. And the more I've studied equine behavior and equine sciences, the more I've learned the degree to which I was given information that was inherently wrong. So before we go into the studies on the hoof, let's talk about the functions of the hoof. First and foremost, one of the most important functions of the hoof is shock absorption. The hoof absorbs the vast majority of the shock of the body's impact with the ground, and it helps to dampen the shock that the joints of the horse will feel. So the hoof is a very, very important shock absorbing structure. It also is there to withstand the forces of weight bearing and locomotion. Horses are very big, powerful animals. They might change direction suddenly. They might be running across uneven ground, and the hoof helps them to withstand these forces without creating injury. Another important function of the hoof is pumping blood. This is an undervalued function of the hoof that a lot of people don't even know about. With every step, the hoof hits the ground, expands on impact, and then it contracts again as the hoof leaves the ground, which pumps the blood back up the leg. The frog is a very important mechanism for pumping blood and helping with circulation. And as it hits the ground, that's how it helps pump the blood back up the leg. The hoof has a lot of other functions within it, but those are some of the most important ones. And you can also go into more detail on the functions that I listed. There's even more information that you can get out of that, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview. So in horses, foot pain is one of the most common causes of lameness. And there are theories that a lot of the lamenesses we do see that are not in the hoof can stem from hoof issues initially. So lameness can be created due to imbalances and issues within the hoof that then create more force on other parts of the limbs and then cause lameness in the limbs. There are a number of ways that the hoof can implicate soundness issues in other parts of the body, like the soft tissues in the leg or within the joints, and we're going to go into that. So one of the most commonly associated issues with the hoof is navicular disease. This is something that every horse owner doesn't want to hear because it's a rather common problem, and it's often associated with career-ending lameness and chronic unsoundness and soreness within the hoof. For those of you who don't know, navicular disease is not thought to be a singular disease affecting one structure of the hoof. It's thought to be a culmination of a bunch of different potential injuries that impact the function of the hoof and thereby the function of the rest of the body. So the close anatomical relationship of these features is thought to be related to the unsoundness that navicular disease can pose. And these structures are the navicular bone, the collateral sesamoidean ligament, the distal sesamoidean impar ligament, the deep digital flexor tendon, navicular bursa, and the distal interphalangeal joint, or the DIP joint. All of these structures and damage that impacts their function is thought to be correlated with frequent occurrence of combination injuries that are then classed as navicular disease. Navicular disease is essentially diagnosed off of heel pain in the horse in a lot of ways, because for some of these issues you need an MRI to actually properly diagnose them. So there is strong evidence that biomechanical forces acting on the hoof can result in failure of these structures, but it is thought that there are likely multifactored causes that result in navicular disease. By biomechanical forces contributing, what I mean by this is that foot conformation can contribute to these structures taking more impact. So horses with weak or low heels, they see a greater extension of the DIP joint compared to a horse that has stronger and higher heels. This will result in increased pressure that is concentrated on the navicular bone. Hoof conformation has a substantial correlation to the forces that are applied to the equine foot and the structures that help support it. So there is a very clear correlation between forces applied to the hoof and the ratio of heel to toe height. So the lower the heel and the longer the toe, the more impact you tend to see the hoof and the supporting structures take. There's several different studies that show that acute change in heel angle, where the heels are very dropped and collapsed, and especially when they're underrun, that it increases the force in the deep digital flexor tendon. So in a study by Lochner et al. In 1980 and Rai Mersma et al. In 1996, they found that the lowering of the hoof angle increased the tensile force in the deep digital flexor tendon, and when you raise the heel angle, it had the opposite effect, meaning that it lowered the force in the deep digital flexor tendon. I know that those studies are old, but the reason why I'm bringing them up is because there's newer studies that confirm the same thing. So I just want to show that these general perceptions have been going on for a long time and have been recorded in multiple different studies over the course of decades. So the force on the deep digital flexor tendon increases the amount of force on the navicular bone, and in horses with navicular syndrome, it was found to be twofold higher in force than horses without navicular syndrome. So collapsed low heels can cause an increase of force exerted on the navicular bone by the deep digital flexor tendon of up to 14%. Heel height has a very close correlation with the development of navicular syndrome, meaning that horses with low heels very commonly are navicular horses, with over 70% of horses diagnosed with navicular having low heels. So a common solution for navicular disease is shoeing. So this is where I'm going to get into the studies on horseshoes and then share with you my thoughts as to why we need to start modernizing shoeing techniques and the types of materials that we use for horseshoes. Some studies have discovered that the weight of the shoe increases inertia in the limb, which means that it decreases the ability of the limb to resist the changes in velocity as the horse moves their limbs. And this can create a greater risk of injury. On top of that, shoeing has also been shown to alter the concussion dampening mechanism that the hoof has, which means that it increases the amount of impact on the hoof. So in a study in 2019 by Malone and Davies, it was found that shod horses saw a substantially decreased circumference of the hoof. So the hoof tended to be narrower and longer and more oblong shaped. And on top of this, the hoof angle in barefoot horses was found to be quite different, with barefoot horses having a way higher likelihood of having a higher heel and more developed digital cushion, and then shod horses having a lower hoof angle due to having a lower heel and decreased circumference as well. Another study in 2011 found the same thing. They concluded that barefoot trimming resulted in elevation of heel angle and solar angle of the distal phalanx, and these findings were thought to point towards more positive hoof morphology from being barefoot, and they thought that barefoot horses might have a decreased risk of injury because of this. A study in 2017 found that shod horses saw altered locomotion when compared to barefoot horses, and they also found that shod horses saw a decrease in digital cushion depth when compared to barefoot horses. So barefoot horses had more substantial digital cushion than shod horses did, which once again they concluded that barefoot horses might have more optimal hoof morphology. For those of you who don't know the purpose of the digital cushion, it is a very important shock absorbing structure within the foot. So when the digital cushion is compromised, the shock absorbing function of the foot is also compromised. So there has been multiple studies over the course of decades that have found that horseshoes increase impact forces and create higher velocity landings, and also higher peak forces, higher and longer impact vibrations. And these are studies that have been found from 1997 to 2015, as well as some more modern studies like the 2017, 2019, and 2021 studies that I will also be citing down below. Something that I want to note is that when I'm referencing shoes, I'm referencing a traditional steel open-heeled horseshoe. So more modern techniques have sought to replace steel horseshoes with plastic materials or rubber materials, and these shoes did show a dampening effect of impact impact, vibration, and force on the hoof in comparison to steel horseshoes. However, they still did not perform at the same level in terms of shock absorption as the barefoot hoof did. A 2015 study by Prosky et al. Found that a shod forehoof might have limited vascular exchange due to the lack of ability for the hoof to properly have ground contact, and also the impacted ability for the hoof to expand due to the steel horseshoe constricting the heel's ability to expand, along with lifting the frog up off of the ground and not allowing it to compress and assist in circulatory capacity. This altered lower limb and hoof load dispersion, and the conclusion was that it may lead to an increase of lameness over time due to the lack of circulatory capacity of the shod hoof compared to a barefoot hoof. A 2013 study by de Klerk found that barefoot hooves saw significantly fewer underrun heels. They saw steeper heel angles, wider circumference, and larger frog size when compared to shod horses. The conclusion of the study was that the significant difference in hoof conformation of barefoot horses to shod should be considered when we're managing horses, because hoof conformation impacts the internal loading structure of the hoof and thereby influences hoof pathology and the function of the hoof. In the same study, they found that 75.5% of shod horses had underrun heels compared to 40.5% of barefoot horses having underrun heels. So underrun heels were seen in both subsets of horses, but they were substantially more common in shod horses, which suggested that shoes may influence an underrun heel. This was thought to possibly be due to the shoe compressing the heels and flattening them as a result, and then running them forward throughout the growth cycle of the hoof. So small changes in hoof structure can result in large changes in the amount of force applied to the hoof and the other structures of the body. A 2004 study found that a 1 degree change in solar angle induces a 4% change in the strain of the digital flexor tendon and the pressure experienced by the navicular bone as a result. Another study found that a 5% change in heel angle results in significantly less stress and displacement of distal limb structures. A study by Holroyd in 2013 also found that hoof growth and management influences locomotor, biomechanics, and hoof conformation. There is a couple of other studies that also found that frog contact to the ground is very important, and that larger frogs and thereby larger frog contact to the ground aids in the hoof's hemodynamic mechanism by helping with healing, growth, and energy dissipation due to the increased circulation. So it has been suggested by studies like this that the frog grows as it becomes a greater weight-bearing structure of the hoof and as it is used more. So barefoot horses, since they have more frog contact, they have more stimulation for the frog to grow because they're impacting the ground more instead of being raised above the ground like what you would see in shod horses. This is said to be advantageous for the distal limb because the increased frog ground contact increases blood flow and aids in healing, energy dissipation, and growth of the foot. The conclusion of a study in 2016 by Leatherwood et al. Was that the data indicated that a shod foredigit may cause changes in hoof morphology due to alterations in lower limb movement and hoof load dispersion, and therefore may cause an increase in incidence of lameness over time. Another study in 2019 by Poss was said that poorly developed caudal structures are more likely to suffer negative morphology and subsequent injury. So having well-developed digital cushion and well-developed heels and well-developed frogs is important to horses' overall soundness. Basically, what I want people to think is just that horseshoes have changed very, very little over the course of centuries. Like the traditional good luck symbol horseshoe, the steel open-heeled horseshoe, has been something we have been shoeing with for centuries with very, very little change. Now, more recently, we're seeing differences in materials being used, but it's quite recent and it's not super common even still. Overwhelmingly so, we see horses being shod with metal horseshoe. With humans, we understand that metal isn't a shock-absorbing material. So using metal as the main medium between the foot of a 1,000-pound animal that is so fast, so powerful, and that we're asking you to do so much physical activity, I think is inherently flawed. Another alternative to steel horseshoes that is viable is hoof boots. A study in 2016, they found that hoof boots prolong the stance time and the time of braking force peak, which is indicative of a slower deceleration phase during limb impact with the ground. They also found that it increased the sole length in contact with the ground. They were said to be a good viable alternative to horseshoes for horses who want more protection. To conclude, there are numerous studies that show that traditional open-heeled steel horseshoes are very commonly used as a way of managing hoof pain, but there is evidence that they increase the risk of developing pathologies and other lamenesses over time, and that they impact the load-bearing structure that is the hoof to the point where it tends to change the structure of the hoof over time. I can't go into all of the different ways that hooves can be managed to be healthier, because management and diet does play a huge role, but trimming and how we shoe them also plays a huge role. A big benefit to being able to keep a horse barefoot or using hoof boots is that you can do maintenance trims throughout the cycle to help avoid the hoof growing to a point where it is starting to deform. Whereas when shoes are on, you can't do maintenance trims until they're off, and the average cycle for horseshoes is 6 to 8 weeks, which means that it can distort how the conformation of the hoof looks over time due to the hoof growing while being resisted by a metal horseshoe. So for me personally, I, for years, believed that horseshoes were a necessity for horses who were working and in sport, and I was led to believe that metal horseshoes were shock absorbing, which is very far from the truth. And now I can understand that it doesn't make sense. So all of my horses are barefoot right now, and I would shoe them again if I had need to. Right now, being barefoot and using hoof boots as needed works great for me, so I probably won't change that. But if I were to shoe again, I would be more likely to choose glue-on horseshoes, or if I did nail-ons, I would be using a polyurethane type shoe or a rubber shoe with frog support. I wouldn't use an open-heeled shoe that doesn't have frog support, and I wouldn't shoe them with metal again. I would avoid nails because there was some other studies that found that nail-on horseshoes, even when you use different materials, might have a hard time dampening the impact of the hoof hitting the ground due to the shock going up the nails into the hoof wall. There does need to be more research done on this, but there's enough research out now showing the correlation of horseshoes amplifying the amount of shock the body sees. In addition to a lot of hoof care providers out there on social media doing case studies with the types of horses they see, and their case studies being consistent with these scientific findings of shod horses having poorer quality frogs, lower heels, collapsed caudal structure. So for me, from what I've seen from people who are posting case studies versus what the studies show, it tracks and there's a clear trend. So I really do think that we need to start changing the way that we approach hoof care in horses, because I personally am of the mind that a lot of the soundness issues that we see in horses, and even a good portion of behavioral issues, could be due to poor hoof care and could be due to us really impacting their natural biomechanics by creating more shock. And a lot of the lamenesses that we then see in horses, in theory, could be fairly avoidable with better management of their feet and also just better management in general to allow them to move around more. As we know, lack of turnout tends to increase the risk of soft tissue injuries. So when you have compounding care practices that implicate the same structures in a negative way, then you increase the risk of unsoundness. So this isn't to make people feel bad if your horse is shod or anything, but to give you information to come to educated decisions for your horse, or even just give you information to look further into, because there's actually a lot of research out on this, and currently there is definitely enough evidence to support the idea that we need to continue researching and making changes to how we approach hoof care in horses in order to help avoid lameness, because lameness problems in horses are very, very common. And if we want to promote longevity in sport horses and in our pleasure riding horses, we need to start looking into modern research and making changes as needed. And I encourage people to do that. Continue learning, continue educating yourself. If these studies at any point are disproven or new information comes out, my opinion is subject to change at that point as well. And I encourage everyone to approach these things in the same type of way. I personally have seen a lot of positive differences in my horses since starting to go barefoot and promoting an environment that allows for healthy barefoot feet. So from what I've seen anecdotally with my own experience, along with studies and what I've seen in case studies from other hoof professionals, I think that the information is going to continue to point in the direction that it already is personally, but I'm open to being proven wrong if more information comes out, as should anyone. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out the sources down below and let me know what your thoughts are, and if you enjoyed this and if you'd like more videos like this, because I've saved a lot of different studies on a lot of different topics pertaining to equine sciences, including bits, different types of equipment, sport horse injuries, different types of sports and horses' behavior in those sports, horse welfare, and so much more. So let me know your thoughts, and if there's anything in particular you'd like me to do a video on, and I will check them out below. Also, please check out my links down below if you're interested in other ways to support my work. I do a lot of research on my own time for free. Like all these studies, I spent literally like 7 hours in a day hyper-focusing, looking through these studies and organizing them and saving them. So if you're interested in supporting my work and continuing to help get these videos put out, I have a Patreon channel where you can access extra information. I have an online store where you can shop products like this satin-lined toque, many different colors, or base layers, riding clothes, horse bridles, and more. Check those out down below as well. Thanks so much.